opportunity for women's organisations everywhere to try and do some bottom-up monitoring about what are the kinds of things that are affecting their members, and as a way of trying to make more visible what is still very invisible. So recognising, those are ways of trying to recognise what the role of unpaid domestic work is in a crisis, and use our social science methods of investigation to try and make visible what people actually tend to take for granted. I mean, it's just what women do, isn't it? To get fuel, water, and food on the table. So unless you have a strategy for getting people to articulate it, it may be invisible because people take it for granted. But trying to use some of our social science research techniques to make it visible, to ensure that it gets recognised in discussions of the crisis. But then reducing unpaid work in the crisis, because it is a bit of a desperation measure to try and be coping with the crisis by taking on more and more unpaid work. So to reduce the extent to which there's going to be an increase in unpaid work as a crisis response, support the purchasing power of poor women. With programs that disperse rapidly, the multiplier effect of spending on roads and cars may not reach poor women until it's too late. I think that you had a fiscal stimulus here, I think. And I think your fiscal stimulus addressed the issue of cars. The one in the US addressed the issue of cars. The one in Australia addressed cars and roads. The one in the UK, cars and roads. The one in Germany, cars and roads. The one in France, cars and roads. I thought maybe it's just the rich countries. No, the one in India is cars and roads. The one in Brazil is cars and roads. The one in Mexico is cars and roads. So there's been a lot of focus, good in this crisis, that there has been that focus on expanding public expenditure to try and support jobs, but a lot of it has been cars and roads. Now, that will eventually trickle through to other people besides the ones who are directly employed in the car industry and in the construction industry. Those food vendors will be able to sell to somebody, there'll be somebody who wants more clothes, but it may take quite a long time for that to get through to the poor women who desperately need it right now. So women in India, for instance, have been pressing for their government to spend some money now that will reach poor women, especially in informal employment, more quickly. Cars and roads is okay, but let's have some of that money that is actually going to reach poor women more quickly. Some of the kinds of measures that you could use. Cash transfers, welfare benefits, things, money that goes to people when they have their incomes too low. There are cash transfer programs now in quite a lot of developing countries. Scale them up. There's a lot of discussion now about scaling them up. Address the people who become newly poor, not just the ones who identified last year as poor. Raise the thresholds for that. Make them simpler by taking away the conditions that are currently attached to them in many countries. Ensure that microfinance isn't reduced by the crisis, but I think don't rely on microfinance as a solution. Microfinance is also micro-debt. Microcredit always sounds very good, but it doesn't remind people you're advocating more indebtedness as a response to this crisis. So until markets have picked up a bit, until people who've taken those loans have got somebody to sell to, microfinance has got a limited role, but we don't want it reduced. And direct some of the fiscal stimulus to support women in self-employment, support for women farmers, women handicraft workers, for instance. Don't just concentrate the fiscal stimulus on things like roads and cars. And in the medium term, I think there's an opportunity to think about using fiscal stimulus to build the kind of infrastructure that will reduce women's burden of unpaid work. Things like collecting fuel and water. That can both provide jobs for men in extending water and sanitation systems and access to cheaper and cleaner energy, but also reduce women's unpaid work burden. So there are ways you can think of reducing unpaid work both immediately to make sure that women don't have to do too much of it as a coping strategy, and then in the medium term as a way of reducing it for the future. And that idea of using the fiscal stimulus to build this kind of infrastructure connects with that idea that has been under discussion about, can't we do more with the fiscal stimulus than just create the kind of jobs we had before? Shouldn't we be using it to build the kind of new resources that we need for the future? And I think thinking about sustainable systems for fuel and water for poor women in rural areas and in poor countries is an important issue there. My third R, you see, these are the 3 R's of unpaid work: recognition, reduction, and now redistributing unpaid work in a crisis. We have to make sure that existing systems that may be in place to redistribute unpaid work, for instance, the rights to maternal leave, which means that the broader community contributes to the costs of having children, and continue to be supported by public funds. We have to make sure that public provision of care services, whether for children, elderly or sick people, are not cut. But I just want to float this idea and see what you think about this. Could we be as ambitious as to think about challenging gender norms a bit? Could we encourage men to contribute a larger share of unpaid work in a context in which many men are going to be enduring a demoralising idleness? They've grown out of their jobs, they're demoralised, they feel they're useless, and they can engage in self-destructive behaviour when they're in that mode of work. Can we find ways of enabling unemployed men to find a new sense of purpose in contributing more to the care of their children and their sick and elderly relatives? Can we think about means of encouraging this through the organisation of men by voluntary organisations? Some countries in Africa already have got a lot of work by voluntary organisations in mobilising people to provide unpaid care for people who have HIV/AIDS. And some of them are now starting to think, how can we get more men involved in this? So is that a way forward we can think of? So could this crisis also be a way of getting people to rethink a little bit what are the gender norms, and perhaps shape them up a little bit and encourage more of a redistribution of unpaid work. But all of that requires a supportive macroeconomic framework. It requires a fiscal policy, the monetary policy, the trade policy that's going to be supportive of that. And I already mentioned fiscal stimulus in the case of India, and a number of other countries have been able to introduce a fiscal stimulus as well. But many governments in low and middle income countries have not. And it's been argued that they don't have the so-called fiscal space to have increased public expenditure because they can't finance an increase in public expenditure. They can't sell their treasury bills and their bonds on the open market and have a bunch of people buy them to finance their extra public expenditure. In fact, there's a UNESCO report that says that 43 of 48 low-income countries have no fiscal space for a stimulus. And in fact, I think in many countries, there's no talk of fiscal stimulus anymore. It's talk of cutting public expenditure, actually cutting all of those programs that are very important in reducing gender inequality. Now, we learned from the G20 that it's going to be okay because the IMF is going to be given a lot more money and this will be made available to countries that run into trouble as a result of a financial crisis that's external to them.